Hello, everyone. This is Matt Vaughn from the Lake Champlain Basin program. Thanks for joining us. We are expecting a few more people to join in as we go here, but I think we'll just get started and they can join us when they can. So this is part of a webinar series, the first installment of a webinar series on green infrastructure for municipalities in the New York portion of Lake Champlain Basin. And this is a project that us here at the Basin program partnered with Watershed Consulting Associates and Hirschman Water and Environment in Virginia to come up with a document that would complement the New York State guidance document for stormwater management, specifically to help municipalities develop green infrastructure when they're thinking about how to manage their stormwater. Today we're going to be hearing from Dave Hirschman, who is an expert in this field and has over 30 years of experience in developing these green infrastructure projects. So without further ado, I will pass off to Dave. Just one more note, I guess, you can find the actual document that we're going over today in the other series at the Lake Champlain Basin program website, and you can also see the schedule for other webinars just like this one throughout the rest of the field season here. So thank you again for joining, and Dave, you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thanks very much. And I want to thank you and the Lake Champlain Basin program and also NUIPIC for this project. This has been a great effort to try to promote a different way of thinking about stormwater in the Lake Champlain Basin. So I'm going to jump right in to here. And just to mention, we also have Dana Allen on the line from Watershed Consulting Associates. And greetings, Dana. I know you're going to jump in on some of these slides. We all know about this change in hydrology when sites develop or when towns or villages or cities develop, and we get a lot more runoff with impervious surfaces. So really the crux of green infrastructure, can you guys see my mouse when I move it around the slide here?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So the trick that we've always wrestled with in this field is, can we take a landscape like that and make it function hydrologically, probably more realistically like that? It'd be very difficult to get back to that. But that's kind of what we're talking about with green infrastructure. The manual that we wrote for the Basin Commission had an introduction that talked about what is green infrastructure, and here it's a synopsis of that definition. I highlighted a few things in there, of course, in green. The idea is to mimic natural hydrology, and that's just what I talked about. Can we take a more developed landscape, lots of impervious cover, and make it function hydrologically more like a natural landscape? Pretty tricky, but that's what the lofty objective of green infrastructure is. And you can see the second bullet down there. It's really not a system that is completely replaces what we call the gray infrastructure of curb inlets and pipes, because we realize obviously in cities and villages that system's already in place and it's not going to go away. Perhaps with something like a new development project where you're starting from scratch with design, that you could conceivably go total green. But in the context of this manual, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, we're thinking of it as a complementary system that works with the existing storm sewer system or the gray infrastructure, and that we are retrofitting in other types of green practices closer to the source of runoff. And you can see the definition there. So that's kind of what we're talking about with this manual. And this is EPA's definition, which is very similar in terms of working with the gray infrastructure and close to the source. And if you are interested in EPA's take on green infrastructure, they have a whole web page there that you can see the link to. And of course, this webinar will be archived, so you will have access to all these slides as downloadable, I think on YouTube. Is that correct, Matt?
Yes, that's right. We're going to post this recording on YouTube. Yep.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So here's the crux of the issue with our existing developed landscape, that if we have vegetation, if we have dirt and soil and things that would seemingly be able to absorb stormwater, we kind of stick them up here on this pedestal, up on a curb, and most of the runoff bypasses it and it goes right into the gray infrastructure system, the inlets and the pipes. By contrast, a green infrastructure system is designed to capture that water. So you can see it's obviously not up on that pedestal. It's sunken down a little bit, and it's using the vegetation and using the soil to collect and treat that runoff. And as explained in the definition, close to the source of runoff, which in this case is this parking lot. That brings us to this concept of stormwater retrofits. So what is a stormwater retrofit? If we are going to put green infrastructure into a village street or a hardscape or a parking lot or a rural road or a building, how are we going to do that? Well, that involves trying to retrofit the existing system. So that's what a retrofit is, just by way of defining some of the terms that we use. It's putting in a stormwater management practice in a location where stormwater controls did not previously exist or were ineffective. So it could be that there is some stormwater control in place in these locations, but maybe they're vintage 1970 or 1980 or even in the 90s, and they didn't do a great job of treating for water quality treatment to try to take some of the pollutants out. A couple examples of retrofits: you can go into existing stormwater basins and try to lengthen the flow path. So that's what they did here. This used to be a straight shot from the water coming into the overflow structure, and they put these weirs and berms in to try to make a very linear flow path so that there would be more treatment for that drop of water that's flowing around that system. This is another type of retrofit in the street system, and you can see here this median just used to be an asphalt median. It used to be impervious cover that contributed to the stormwater problem. So they retrofitted again. It's kind of sunken down with curb cuts so that the water from at least half the travel lane on both sides flows into the system. So that was another example of a retrofit. And there's many, many different ways to do retrofits. You can use different materials, different plants, different types of structures. So this is an example from West Union, Iowa. It's a photo is a credit of the Conservation Design Forum, which is in Chicago area. But this little town in Iowa had a terrible problem with flooding. Even a modest rain would flood the downtown. And they had an issue of redesigning the storm system, just making the pipes bigger. And the cost of that was just tremendous because they had to dig up the streets and put in all these pipes. So they decided to do it with permeable parking. And that really took care of the issue. So basically they replaced the whole downtown area with permeable parking or permeable pavement. You can see here, and little rain gardens and biofilters also. So that was retrofit on somewhat of a bigger scale than you usually see, but it worked very well. Speaking of scale, there's a lot of watershed groups and groups like the Lake Champlain Basin program and other groups in Vermont that are really promoting retrofits on the small scale, on individual parcels, individual properties, so that every individual lot can start contributing to cleaning up the water. Here's a few other examples of residential scale retrofits with permeable pavement and rainwater harvesting, rain barrels. So that's the context for the reason this manual came about. And it's targeted towards New York's Lake Champlain Basin. And the reason for that is because Vermont had similar things going on. But this is the manual. It's free to download at the Basin Program website, which you see at the bottom of the screen there. And it's encourage everybody to download read it page for page. It's actually quite easy to get through because of the way it's organized. So what's the niche for this manual? Why is there yet another stormwater manual out here in the stormwater management world? And doesn't New York already have a stormwater management manual? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. New York DEC has their stormwater design manual. And so as you can see here on the left, if you're dealing with a new development project or redevelopment that is 1 acre or greater of disturbed land and certain industrial sites, then you're kind of in the hopper of the regulatory path here, which is the regulations, the construction permits, and your design manual is probably going to be the New York Stormwater Management Design Manual, which you can see the URL for that there. However, if you're doing one of these retrofits that we just talked about, you want to put some green infrastructure into your existing developed land and maybe integrate it with your existing infrastructure, you can certainly use New York's manual, but we look at this manual as complementary to that, and it gives you some additional ideas for that context of the retrofit. And that's how these two things will work together. Here is the table of contents for the Lake Champlain manual, and we'll go through each of these things a little bit here today by way of just introducing the contents of the manual. And by the way, that's really the purpose of this introductory webinar, is to show you what's in here and to pretty much queue up the subsequent webinars which will be taking place for the rest of June and into July. Thinking about retrofits and how we might put green infrastructure into different places in the developed landscape. We divided that into these 4 categories: into village streets, which means it's already developed, rural roads, parking lots and hardscapes, and buildings. And these are what we call the green stormwater infrastructure settings. And the different chapters of the manual are organized by these different 4 categories. The manual also has a flow chart. This is an example of the village street flow chart, which is a fairly simple approach to help you identify which green stormwater infrastructure practices may be worth exploring for the context that you're looking at. So this obviously talks about impervious cover reduction and preservation of natural features. But here's where the important split takes place. You may have some green spaces, some lawn, some basically underutilized pervious areas that are available for green infrastructure. Or on the other hand, you could be in a downtown area where there's really not much of that going on. There's not a lot of green space available to stick new practices in. So that kind of divides you into whether you're going to be doing some bioretention or surface type practices, or whether you might be doing something where the stormwater takes place as part of the pavement, such as a permeable hardscape or underground, or even getting down to the receiving stream in some cases where that is in a storm sewer system and could be daylighted. There's a flow chart similar to this for each of those 4 green stormwater infrastructure settings from the previous slide. Here's just a few examples of these different settings where you have a parking lot, which is a hardscape going into bioretention, permeable hardscape here. This is underground storage for infiltration, and this is a treatment for a rural road that's causing erosion. So just a quick visual idea of what those 4 categories might look like. Example, and these are all examples from the manual itself. The manual has an introduction to each of these 4 settings, as well as a bunch of case studies. Really, it's quite impressive how many case studies from New York and Vermont there are in these 4 categories. And the manual breaks it down, these case studies of what happened, what was there before. So this is one example from the Village Streets case study where obviously they had some green space just sitting there next to the road, and that was the retrofit that they did, and that probably will be presented in the Village Streets webinar, which is coming up June 8th. That's 1 week from today. So if you're interested in Village Streets and these types of retrofits, and there's a lot more in there, I'd encourage you to download the manual and look at those case studies. You will hear a bit more about that. Next week's webinar, as well as all the subsequent webinars, will feature some guest speakers who have actually designed or managed these types of retrofits in these different settings. Here's another example of a Village Street retrofit, which is very simple, turning the water out into a dry well. And this is from Bolton, town of Bolton. And then if it keeps raining and the dry well fills up, there's an overflow back into the drainage system there. So you can see these are at different scales, different levels of sophistication, and we try to cover all that in the manual. The next setting is rural roads. There's a lot of places in New York and Vermont where there's many miles of rural roads, not all of which are functioning so well hydrologically or in terms of impacts to receiving water. So this was a Vermont Better Back Roads program retrofit. You can see this situation over here is in not very good shape. So the retrofit was basically to narrow the road and to make the conveyance. You can see some check dams there. And so that was an example of a rural road retrofit. And that webinar is going to be on June 22nd. I think Dana is going to be leading the charge on that one. And so there's more examples of that as well. The third category, parking lots and hardscapes. This is the U.S. Oval Bioretention Project in Plattsburgh, New York. And you can see this parking lot and other areas, travelways of impervious cover. And this was a retrofit where they put bioretention in the drainage system. They had the space available, and they're treating the water with that bioretention area. So that's an example of a retrofit for a permeable hardscape. I mean, for a hardscape parking lot or roadway. We are having an in-person operation and maintenance training right here at this facility on June 15th, and that will be in Plattsburgh, New York. You can register for that on the Lake Champlain Basin Program webpage, which we'll show you here in a little while, but that's pretty much going to be starting at 10 o'clock. We'll go up through lunch with some classroom sessions, and then we'll be practicing some operation and maintenance checklists out in the field in the afternoon of that day, June 15th. But also, if you're interested in parking and hardscapes, we have a webinar just on that topic on June 29th. Again, same time here, 12 to 1. So there's two events really that are going to address this topic, although the in-person O&M training is really meant to address all four of the settings that we're talking about. Finally, the fourth setting that we're going to talk about, and that's in the manual, is the buildings. And these are examples. Here's a rainwater harvesting system from Syracuse, from the Moore Memorial Arena. And I believe they use that water for, Dana, do you remember what it was, irrigation or something in the building, I believe it was. And this is an example of green roof.
Hey, Dave, that is correct. They do use it for, sorry, I was muted. They do use it for irrigation for the lands, and I think maybe potentially for making ice as well in that particular case.
That's what it was. Yeah, that was making ice. And this beautiful green roof over here from Lake Placid. And Dana, will both of these be covered as case studies in the webinar?
I think we're going to be focusing a lot on examples from Syracuse, as Madison from Save the Rain down in Syracuse will be joining us as the guest presenter for that. So we may touch on the green roof, but mostly Syracuse examples.
Okay. Both very nice examples. And that webinar, Dana's going to be leading that one as well. That's off in July, a little bit of time, July 13th. And that will be our final webinar. So please spread the word about these webinars. They'll be archived, available on YouTube, so you can get together with your friends and colleagues and have a happy hour or an early breakfast and watch these webinars. So this is the idea that we're going to integrate green into gray, that we're going to integrate the green stormwater infrastructure into the existing system in these 4 categories: the buildings, the parking and hardscapes, the village streets, and the rural roads. There's this idea afoot in the world of green infrastructure nationally that we should pursue what's called here a dig once strategy. That we have infrastructure already out there. We got to take care of it. That infrastructure is roadways, it's pipes, ditches, inlets, all the stuff that's already out there that has something to do, that touches the stormwater. And sometimes this stuff needs to be upgraded. Sometimes it needs to be repaired. So the idea of dig once is if you're going to touch some piece of infrastructure, then put some green into it. Put something in there that's going to do some filtering, that's going to treat for water quality. And that's the essence of the dig once strategy. This is an example. Again, it's also shown in the manual of this Lake George porous asphalt street. So they were going to redo the street anyway, and they dug a little bit more and they made it porous, and that was an example of a dig once effort there. This is a pave once, maybe not dig once, but this is another example from Syracuse where they had a basketball court, and instead of just repaving it with regular asphalt, they made it a porous basketball court. So that's dig once, pave once. The idea is basically you've got a procurement process, you've got a lot of stuff going on with design, you've got equipment mobilizing to the site, you've got contractors, and the idea is to not duplicate where you don't have to. If you can dig once, it has the promise of being cost effective and that you can share costs. The green part might come from a grant, might come from a different pot of funding, but if those things can be combined with your gray funding or your O&M type of funding for your gray, then you might save some money, you might save some time, and it's worth pursuing because it might be a streamlined process. And importantly, if you take on the ethic within a local community that every time you're going to touch a piece of gray, you're going to at least try to consider putting in some green. It probably won't happen 100% of the time, but if you have a process pretty early on where you say, I wonder what kind of green might fit into this gray, because we're going to be digging up the street, we're going to be putting addition on the school, we're going to be redoing the park, we're going to be adding to the library, all those different types of settings. If you think about it early enough, it might be okay. It might work out to stick in some gray. So those are some of the advantages. However, anytime you're talking about local government process or bureaucracies or procurement, there are a lot of challenges. And it's what we try to do in the manual is to be very upfront about those challenges and offer some suggestions or workarounds. And some of the challenges that are identified with this dig once strategy is you might have a grant to do the green part, but the grant cycle may not exactly line up with the gray repair. And so lining up these grant and funding cycles can be pretty tricky. Some of the people around the country that have tried dig once have claimed there's not enough available guidance on how to do it. And the guidance would be, if you're going to do permeable pavement, what are the specifications you should follow? If you're going to do bioretention, how are you going to do it? What's the soil media? What's the ponding depth? Fortunately, we put out this manual just to put some guidance out there on the street. So the manual, we hope, will fill that challenge. The third bullet there is very important. There's so many lessons from across the country where at the front end, during design, people didn't really think about the idea that these things have to be maintained. And if you don't think about maintenance at the front end, you're probably going to be surprised in year 1, year 3, or year 5 that things seem to be getting out of hand, that some design elements almost made it very difficult or even impossible to maintain the practice. So this was a challenge that was noted by many practitioners, that you really got to think about maintenance when you design the projects. Municipal processes and codes. Sometimes local codes can be kind of hard on green infrastructure by not allowing surface vegetative practices to exist in certain locations. Planning, feasibility, and prioritizing. So that's a kind of an upfront step that should be done anytime you're thinking about putting some green infrastructure into the landscape. And the idea that we could work regionally, Lake Champlain Basin program is a perfect setup for that, that they perhaps could serve as a clearinghouse of lessons learned, ideas, webinars like this, funding the manuals, get-togethers, trainings, and things like that. A lot of these challenges were articulated down here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where I'm a resident. There was a workshop last year. Actually, it was just earlier this year. The report was done earlier this year. The workshop was in June of last year, where they got the people together from all over the watershed, representing government agencies and design professionals, local government, MS4 people, funders, and there was this big brainstorming session on this Dig Once strategy, and some of these challenges I just talked about came out of that. And there's a report, if anybody's interested in the report, I can send it to Matt and Lake Champlain group, and maybe they could put it on the website. But that report goes into quite a bit of detail about the challenges and also some of the ways to address those challenges with this idea of Dig Once. So that's all to say that there's a chapter in the Lake Champlain Green Infrastructure Manual, which is just on this topic of planning and implementation. And Chapter 6 touches on a bunch of the stuff I've been talking about. What are the prerequisites for even mounting the effort to put some green infrastructure in your community? What should you consider early on in the process? Not at design, not at installation, and certainly not at maintenance, but early on when you're just thinking about the ideas. What are some of the key considerations? Planning and design, project construction, and maintenance. So that Chapter 6 in the manual addresses all those things. So here's a little quiz that we can get people to type maybe their response in the chat box. What's the most important part of stormwater planning? A, the free barbecue at the stakeholder meetings. That's certainly true in Virginia. B, estimating load or volume reductions. C, getting out in the field to identify sources and solutions. D, building implementation support from the beginning. Or E, documenting findings. Yep, definitely the barbecue. That's, Dana's got it. I don't know what the equivalent would be in New York. There's probably a kielbasa or something like that, but that's, you got to feed the folks, but I think the real answer is all of the above, but maybe B through E might be a little bit more important than the barbecue. Yep, got the maple. Of course, maple. Here's just a couple visual examples of what we're talking about with some of the barriers or challenges in the process of integrating green infrastructure. And as you can see here, we all have codes. Every place, village, and town and city has some kind of code that talks about the width of streets, whether you need curb and gutter. So sometimes these codes can make green infrastructure pretty hard to do. If you have to have curb and gutter, if you have to have a 36 or 50 foot wide right of way, those are the kind of impediments that should be identified really as a planning process and maybe through a structured process to remove those impediments from local codes. And my former employer, the Center for Watershed Protection, has a very tried and true method called better site design and local roundtables, which have done just that. I think CWP webpage has tons of stuff on the better site design process. Here's another example of a cul-de-sac. Obviously up here, you got a huge cul-de-sac. I mean, basically, a lot of this stuff may be driven by pulling in 3 fire trucks at once. If every house in the cul-de-sac were on fire all at the same time. But as you can see here, other solutions might be possible where you can put some green in. So that might be a code issue at any local government. Parking lot imperviousness. This shows overflow parking and grass, and it's a reinforced grass. I think it's one of those products with the rings or the superstructure that allows people to park on this. But this kind of parking lot that's designed for Christmas Eve, you know, maybe the overflow could be green, but it has to be allowed in the code. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Identify and prioritize your projects and promote the co-benefits. In that Chesapeake Bay workshop I referred to, we talked a lot about co-benefits. And for this reason, if you're an elected official, if you're a citizen, if you're a business, if you're a civic organization, you know, a lot of this talk about anything with infrastructure or green or stormwater management, that's just an eye glazing over type of entry into why the community should undertake anything, right? It's pretty like technocratic. But people like their clean drinking water. They may be very concerned about drainage or flooding issues in their neighborhood. They might be concerned about, you know, is there enough trees? Is the community healthy? Are people out walking? Are there paths along creeks? Is there recreation? Is there opportunities for green jobs and economic development? Is there a way to invest in challenged neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera? So whenever you're talking about green stormwater infrastructure, don't lead off and just talk about GSI this and GSI that. You want to see what's really of importance to the people in that community and weave green infrastructure in, because green infrastructure has benefits in all these different categories. So it's kind of messaging is what we're talking about here. And so here's just a few examples of recreation, fisheries, and people losing land to erosion. Obviously, green stormwater infrastructure or any type of infrastructure ain't going to do much in this type of flooding situation. But there is evidence that over long periods of time, if you do enough green, you can reduce at least a nuisance level of flooding. We had in the slide the importance of prioritizing, and that can't be stressed enough. People can go in the field and they can say, well, let's stick something here, let's stick something there. That seems like a good idea to me, and we'll just green the world, and that might be $7 million later. You can't do it all. You can't do every project that seems like a good idea. So there has to be a systematic way to score, rank, and prioritize your projects. And you might pick different ways to do that. This is just an example. This has 4 different criteria: cost effectiveness, which is always going to be important, the ability of a practice or a project to serve an outreach and education function, community benefits, those are some of those co-benefits we just talked about, challenges with design and permitting. So those are 4 pretty simple scoring criteria, what we call screening factors. And this is just very theoretical. It shows different types of projects you might do, and it scores them, and it gives you kind of a master score of there on the right-hand column. And it just might be high, medium, or low. You can do it quantitatively or qualitatively. The point is, look at your suite of projects that you have identified through some type of inventory process in your community, score, rank, and prioritize them, and check in with the community, check in with the stakeholders about what they consider to be priority projects. That is worth doing. Unfortunately, it's a process. It takes time. It takes staff. It takes resources. And there's many examples across the country where green infrastructure projects skipped this early step, and they had problems later on. And that's why we're stressing the importance of this process. Everybody wants to know about cost. We have all these great ideas of green. How much is it going to cost? is it cost effective? Information is available. It's out there on the websites of many different organizations, including Center for Watershed Protection, WEF and WERF, and state agencies. It's hard. It's really hard to pin down costs. The idea is at the planning stage, you're probably going to use literature values, use some of these existing resources for the different costs and the cost effectiveness. This is one that Center for Watershed Protection did fairly recently for the city of Richmond, which is in Virginia. Total nitrogen cost effectiveness, total phosphorus, total suspended solids, and you can see it looks at a lot of different types of projects in there. So literature values are available. I wouldn't rely on these when you actually get to your design process because there are so many variables when you get to the project-specific technicalities that the cost really has to be looked at. You have to sharpen the pencil when you get to that stage. But cost, it's always going to be the first thing that the city councilor or the council person is going to be asking about, or the public works director. Now, we want to put numbers on everything. This is a great quote from Albert Einstein. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. It's really hard to say, quantify the benefits of a pet waste program or a riparian restoration if we're trying to bring everything down to the dollars per pound of nitrogen reduced, or an illicit discharge program here, or education. Just to say cost is important, but you have to put it in context, and that's why these other screening factors like community benefits, opportunities for education and outreach, they're good to throw into your ranking and prioritization so that you can take account, you can fold in these other types of projects and not have them be discarded just because they're hard to quantify. Another planning step, very, very important. A lot of times, the work up front with utilities, dry utilities as well as wet utilities, feasibility. A lot of things can be put on paper, but unless you know that they are feasible, are the soils adequate, has the geotechnical work been done, what about existing trees, tree canopy, root zones, can the project be accessed by equipment? And that might have to do with traffic control. So just a few of these types of considerations for feasibility. Again, the lesson from across the country, it's easy to skip this because it takes time, it takes extra money, but it has led to problems down the road. So just to give you some, some sense of what's been important in other places. Finally, maintenance. How can we forget about that? Whenever a project is even conceived, you have to ask who's responsible, who's going to maintain it. Do they have the adequate training, or in some cases certification? Do they have the adequate tools to maintain it? Is there access? What would be the frequency? If there's vegetation, how's that supposed to be maintained? And very importantly, you can see here, can we modify the design to reduce the long-term maintenance burden or maintenance liability of a practice? One of the things I do down here in the Chesapeake Bay is I teach a certification class for landscape professionals called the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Certification. And we talk a lot about this link to design and long-term maintenance responsibility. So there's people around the country thinking about it. I think Seattle, Pacific Northwest, some places in the Southeast and the Midwest, and obviously up in your neck of the woods too, in New York and Vermont. The idea with vegetated practices, the internet is full of beautiful pictures. They usually are taken right after a practice is installed and the landscaping goes in, and it looks kind of neat and orderly. You have these nice mowed edges there, and over time, these things become jungles and thickets, and people start scratching their head and thinking, I didn't know that this thing even had to be maintained, and now I have no idea how to maintain it. So that's the kind of situation we want to avoid by asking all the right questions during the design process. Here's one in the right-of-way. If this turned into a thicket, we'd have sight distance, we'd have safety issues, we'd have neighborhood acceptance issues. So you can't put in something like this without a maintenance plan. Obviously, it's in such a public place where there's traffic flow, just by way of example. Good news for you, New York folks. Your Department of Environmental Conservation has just released this maintenance guidance. This is a chapter in the state stormwater design manual. This just came out, wow, March 31st. I worked on this project when I was with the Center for Watershed Protection with some colleagues there, including Laurel Williamson and Deb Caraco, who's in the Ithaca area. And so this maintenance guide is interesting. It's a different approach. I think New York's approach to maintenance is very unique, as documented in this. What they've put forward here, this maintenance hierarchy, where most of the maintenance tasks or the inspections and maintenance should be done at this level 1, which is the property owner or property manager. If it's a matter of mowing, picking up trash, taking care of vegetation, that's kind of a level 1, and they want to really mobilize these BMP owners or managers to take care of that stuff. I mean, you can't really expect state or municipal staff to take care of a lot of those routine maintenance tasks. So there's checklists and there's guidance for how you do that if you're level 1. Going up the pyramid, if you're level 2, your level 1 people might say, I got a problem here. I really don't know how to take care of it. There's some kind of structural issue. There's erosion. The practice doesn't seem to be getting any water, or it's holding water too long. Those types of issues get bumped up here to level 2, where you'd have a trained municipal staff person take a look at it and do some diagnostics. Why is this problem happening? What are the practical solutions? And if these folks at level 2 get stumped, or they have, if the issue is more serious, it can get bumped up to this qualified level 3 professional. And that's somebody with more training that can really go out there, diagnose, and fix the problem. So that's the hierarchy approach that's in New York, the New York DEC O&M chapter. The Lake Champlain chapter has some similar information, but it's really based on what's in this New York O&M chapter from the Stormwater Design Manual. The New York chapter has O&M checklists and guidance for all these different practices shown here. So I won't read them off, but you can see it's a lot of the green stuff. Because we don't really have a track record of maintaining things for a long period of time. So this is where the guidance is really needed. Here's an example of one of the checklists. This is a level 1. It's a visual checklist, and that for every problem. This one is there's bare soil and erosion or rills or washing of dirt. There's a picture of what that looks like, some actions that can be taken, and here's where you have your kick out. So if the person doing the level 1 inspection says, yeah, that's me, I'm kicking this out to level 2, that would be a sign to get the municipal inspector involved. So that's an example of the checklist. Here's another checklist for bioretention, just to show you some examples of what's in the O&M chapter there. Similar things are in the Lake Champlain manual. Here's one for permeable pavement of the O&M checklist. The other thing that's in the manual is these general problems and solutions, helpful skills, and equipment typically needed to fix that problem. So this is kind of a flow chart when you get to level 2 or 3. Oops. I think I might have just messed myself up on advancing the slides. Oh, here we go. So O&M, if you want to know more about that, I'm coming to New York on June 15th. Dana and I will be there. Matt and Ryan, I hope you guys will be there. Hope some folks from New York DC will be there, who were actually instrumental in putting that chapter together. So this is going to be part classroom and part field exercise. So come on out. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues This is going to be fun. So help us spread the word on that. We're getting towards the end here, but the other thing, going back to the Lake Champlain manual, we talked about the planning, talked about other things. Towards the end of the manual in the back, there's these practice profile sheets. 21 practices. So these are these one-day, very, very brief overviews of different types of practices. So here's one on stream daylighting. These are really useful because if you have seen stormwater design manuals, they are thick, they are complicated, they are long. So this is just by way of giving the public or the public works director or public works manager or stormwater manager a very quick idea of what these different practices entail in terms of how does it work, siting, sizing, and maintenance considerations. All right, Dana, do you want to click in here and go through these funding slides quickly?
Yeah, why don't we just continue sharing your screen and I'll just tell you into advance.
Yeah,
that'd probably be the easiest transition. So, Dave, thanks for this great introduction to the manual. Thanks everyone for attending. I get to talk about money, which everyone loves. And so one of the most important things about getting these projects implemented is where's the money come from? So as the slide says, don't worry, there are funding sources out there. So you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel trying to implement your project. We took a pretty quick look at the funding sources in New York. Luckily, New York DEC and Ryan Waldron in specific has done a lot of work with putting together a lot of these funding sources. So we basically did a selection of the funding sources that are available out there in Chapter 8. So anything that was specific to the Lake Champlain Basin region, we listed those out in Chapter 8. So Dave, why don't you go ahead? So essentially, we wanted to keep this pretty quick and easy. We didn't want to get into the weeds on a lot of details for everything. So we basically broke those funding sources down into a table, and we actually subdivided it into New York-specific funding sources and federal sources, primarily. So that's a table that contains the grant program, the funding source, the program's relationship to GI implementation, green infrastructure implementation, the type of funding, so that kind of relates to the relationship, whether it's funding for planning, whether you're just doing an initial scoping like a master plan or a retrofit analysis. If it's a pilot project, like it's something that you want to get accomplished in your town to then implement elsewhere, that could be an example of a pilot project. Or whether it's just implementation, so you've got the scoping done, you've already maybe done a pilot project elsewhere, or you've seen other examples of this work, and now you're just ready to build something, which is the best part of green infrastructure in many ways, is actually getting to do it. So it breaks it down to that. Many of them overlap, many will be for planning and implementation, that sort of thing. We also tried to get at grant frequency where possible. Not all of these are offered every year, but many are. The amount, some are obviously larger than others. So some are, many hundreds of thousands of dollars for implementation of large projects, while others are smaller, for implementation of small projects or small scoping studies. So, and then a contact where possible for those grant programs. So, and as I already mentioned, it's broken down into New York and federal programs. So Dave, you want to click forward? Awesome. Sorry, this image is a little bit grainy. I just had to grab it from the screen. But anyway, this is what the table looks like. You can see those categories: funding source, who's eligible, summary of the program, so basically what they funded in the past. A lot of different details here. So the fund, what it's for, implementation or planning, pilot project, that sort of thing. And then you'll see that there's a website and a contact. Sometimes we weren't able to find a specific contact, or there isn't a specific contact for many of these. You have to go to the website and just do a contact form. But we did include a hyperlinked website in that website column, so you can easily get there just by clicking through the PDF and getting that website and working through that that process. So, and one important thing to mention, we didn't go into loan programs. There are a great deal of loan programs out there that you could potentially mix up with other capital planning efforts and downtown redevelopment efforts, road projects, that sort of thing. We just looked specifically at grant programs that funded green infrastructure. So that's what you'll find in here. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good start. And speaking of a good start, click forward one, Dave. Funding your GI projects often comes down to who you know and who is a good contact. So here are 4 good contacts. This is all being recorded, so you'll be able to pause this on the video later, or you can try to write these down. I'll keep talking for a second if you want to write them down. But anyway, Ryan Waldron at New York State DEC is a really good contact. Fairly simple email address. Fred Dunlap, who's actually joining us today. Fred has been very helpful in this project all along, and so he actually knows a good deal of these funding sources as well, and knows a lot of the landscape you'd be working in with these municipalities. So, Fred, I just put your email out there. Sorry if you get a million emails, but you're a really good resource for the area, so I think it's important to have. And then general inquiries to the Lake Champlain Basin program. The Basin program is familiar with many of these resources in New York. It's also important to note that the Lake Champlain Basin program is a grant-making agency on its own in association with various programs like NUIPIC, the New England Interstate Water Pollution Prevention, or Water Pollution Commission. I think I got that right. So there are grants available through LCBP, but they're also a good clearinghouse for information. And then another good source of information is someone who's not joining us today, but who we'll meet on June 15th, is Kevin Farrington. He's the city engineer for the city of Plattsburgh. Kevin has implemented a lot of projects in Plattsburgh using some of these funding sources. He's a great source of information. So definitely if you know Kevin or you want to get in touch with him, take his information down there. Yeah, he's definitely negotiated this landscape before, and so he knows how to get these projects done vis-a-vis funding sources. So that's Chapter 8 in a nutshell. It's fairly brief to the point, but it'll definitely get you started on the road to getting some cash to get these projects in the ground. So that's it for me, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Dana. Hang out on the line there because we might have a couple minutes for a Q&A. So you are asking yourself at this point, how can me and my friends and colleagues sign up? Here again are the dates for our sessions here on this manual. Village Streets, June 8th. O&M in person in Plattsburgh, June 15th. Rural Roads, June 22nd. Parking and Hardscapes, June 29th. Buildings, July 13th. All the webinars are 12 to 1, and that would be Eastern Time. And the O&M session is in person. I believe it starts at 10. But basically, you can see here is Lake Champlain Basin program right on the homepage. Click on that right there, and you can register and find out more information. And with that, looks like we're pretty much right on time.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave and Dana. That was great.
Yeah, Matt and Ryan, do you guys, were there any questions in the chat, or do you guys have any questions or comments, color commentary?
I didn't see any questions in the chat. If anyone does have a question, please go ahead and enter it in there, and we can take a minute to answer that. But I think you covered it all. That was a great introduction.
Good. I'm glad that worked out, and we're looking forward to the rest of them. So do you guys want to do the sign-off?
Sure, yeah. I was just giving anyone a minute to answer a question, but it looks like they're not coming in. So okay. We will look forward to seeing you all the next webinar next week, and we'll be in touch about details for the in-person training in Plattsburgh. So thanks again for joining, and thanks again to you, Dave and Dana.
Yeah, and we want to thank you guys, the Basin Program, Matt and Ryan, and NUIPIC, and New York DEC for great collaboration, and really we hope this manual and the resources get in the hands of people, and that we get some green stuff out there. That's the
exciting part. Yep.
So, yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. We'll talk next time.
All right. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.